What follows is a tale of misfortune that befell the dwarven fortress of Bustwatched, and in particular one poor woodcutter named Lobram. The fortress started off fine. We had found a location surrounded by trees and stone, with visible minerals and gems jutting out of the mountainous area to our north. Our dwarves have a varied mix of skills, making them the optimal group of survivors to strike the earth and build a new dwarvish civilization in the wilds around the foot of the youthful mountain. The elders, the raisers of virtue, had sent our group of dwarves out to spread the reach of their civilization, the Silver of Gulfs. As the group began to get set up, a couple of dwarves, Ilril and Ingiz, began to carve out the mountainside, creating shelter where they could begin setting up the new fortress. A couple more dwarves, Tossid and Nil, began to collect plants and fruits from nearby trees to keep them sustained as work commenced. Our woodcutter, Lobram, began planning out an area of trees to clear, allowing for a large opening in the heavy forest where there may be a pasture that could be placed for their animals and a farm to grow their crops. Lobram was an ambitious woodcutter with big ideas, and while he was tough, hardy, and quick to heal, he was not exactly the most creative individual, nor was he actually any good at planning. Like at all. He began moving from tree to tree, scoring the edges to figure out exactly where he could chop to secure the optimal path, as he would then charge through the forest, felling trees left and right. With his strength and stamina, surely he, the mighty Lobram, would be the one dwarf capable of such a feat. As Lobram got to work, the rest of the dwarves had hollowed out a comfortable cavern system, with room for bedding and storage of their supplies that they had brought with them in their cart for their long journey. The team of dwarves, satisfied with their work, began setting up workshops for various things they'll need, such as bedding, seating, tables and doors, the necessities of a functional fortress. The dwarves call in Lobram, their only architect, who has the experience of putting such workshops together over the 63 years of his life. Lobram returns. Wiping the sweat from his brow, he sets up the various workshops for the carpenter, stonemason and crafts dwarf. Without a word, picks up his axe once more, and continues to the heavy forest ahead of him. The rest of the dwarves continue their work before taking a break to socialise and get to know one another. They learn that they're all worshippers of various deities, and their superstitions about life and the world around them are varied just as much as their deities are. After their break, the dwarves prepare to plan out their next workshop, a mechanics workshop to create the mechanisms they'll need to build the well over by the water. Once again, they call back Lobram to build their workshop and wait around chatting. He does not come. They call again and again, but no Lobram. Perhaps he was busy felling trees, as he was so excited to do. However, the group went out to look for him anyway. What they found sent the fortress into turmoil. Earlier, after building the workshops, Lobram returned to the woods to knock down trees. He rushed through them as fast as he could to bring back as many logs as possible to the wood stockpile inside, in an effort to impress his peers. His hasty process and lack of effective planning would be his downfall, as one of the trees he chopped, a large apple tree, fell on him. The tree squashed his chest, bruising his torso badly. Unfortunate to be sure, but not the worst of it. The falling tree also obliterated his right ankle, sending his right foot skidding across the forest floor. Lobram had become incapacitated. He couldn't move. When they found him, his open artery had bled all over the forest floor. Fearing him dead, they pulled him free from beneath the apple tree. He let out a groan of pain. He was alive. The dwarves rushed back toward the entrance of the fortress, carrying him to an area outside as they prepared the hospital indoors. The area that was originally planned out to be their food storage would have to be cleared out to make way for the emergency medical center. Just as Ilril, the expedition leader, rushed outside to bring Lobram in, he was stopped by the others. They feared that by bringing the woodcutter inside, they would bring his misfortune along with him. The dwarves pondered over this for some time, allowing their superstitions to fester and corrupt what they thought was the right thing to do, until they eventually agreed that he could not be allowed into the fortress. If the fortress came to ruin because of his misfortune, what would the Raisers of Virtue think of their resolve as a group? Would they think them incompetent? Unable to complete the important task they'd been set? Iril and the others couldn't risk such a blemish on their stellar records. As the other dwarves went inside, the injured woodcutter bled over the ground. He began to get dehydrated and called for help repeatedly. Nil, always the more caring spirit of the group, couldn't help but rush to his aid after his cries got to be too much for her. She grabbed a bucket and rushed to a nearby pond where she gathered water to keep him alive, for as short as the rest of his life may be. Lobram, despite being left out in the rain and snow at the foot of the youthful mountain, was very thankful for Nil and her compassion. He told her that he wouldn't forget this, but Nil did not respond to him, remaining silent as she went back into the fortress. Days came and went, with Nil occasionally collecting buckets of water to at least keep Lobram hydrated in his final days. However, Lobram, the mighty, with his dazzling constitution, healed. His stumpy, injured leg, although infected, had stopped bleeding, and he began to recover. Still unable to move, he was in need of assistance from the others, but even after his injury came good, they continued to avoid him, only handing the bare necessities over to him to help him survive. Trading caravans came as the weeks went by, with the other dwarves warning them of the misfortune that may befall them if they get too close to the injured woodcutter. They too ignored Lobram, struck by the fear that their long journey ahead may be wrought with terror should they be affected by his apparent curse. The lack of communication, the weather, the attacks by flies that didn't allow him to sleep, all of these things slowly chipped away at Lobram's mind. As hardy a dwarf as he was, his mental constitution paled in comparison to his physical fortitude. The other dwarves, fearing the woodcutter, whose usually hopeful face had turned into a scowl of contempt for his fellow dwarves, stopped providing him with water and food. They allowed him to sit with no supplies until eventually his curse would take him, while they continued working on the fortress, hoping desperately that if they ignored the problem long enough, eventually he would die, and it would all just go away. Lobram began to get dehydrated again, as now not even Nil would provide him with anything. He began to starve, battered by the weather time and time again with no rest. Lobram went mad. He stood up on one leg, the first time he had moved since his injury, and began hobbling to the south into the woods, stripping his clothing down piece by piece. The rest of the dwarves, in the fortress, watched as the nude woodcutter disappeared into the woods south of them, and began to grow saddened by the guilt of what they had done. Their fortress had begun to prosper, with proper trade established, goods that they could export in the form of their precious gems that the youthful mountain was filled with, and a local inn that they had established, the Romantic Sourness, so named for the romantic sour drink that they had created, a sour cider from the local apple trees, one such tree being the one that had maimed Lobram. Was it worth it? Allowing him to fall into insanity, to put themselves at ease and continue to trudge forth? The dwarves began to carve out a slab, with Lobram's name and epitaph upon it, to remember what they had done. Surely he would die out there with his injuries, lack of nutrition, and brutal weather that had battered his body, allowing for no rest. Just as they had placed his headstone in the Hall of the Dead, an area that they had attached to the sensitive chapel, a temple they had established to keep worshipping their various deities, the unthinkable happened. Lobram came back. The naked, insane dwarf ran through the fortress, charging through the crowded inn and down the halls, rushing past the workshops he had created. Local dwarves attempted to catch him, but he was too thin from starvation for anyone to get a grip on him. The women covered the eyes of the children, all terrified and likely scarred by the ordeal. Lobram ran back outside screaming, this time running to the north, past the pen and pasture that he had carved out for the fortress's animals, and up into the mountains. He continued to scream as he scaled the side of the youthful mountain, soon disappearing into the snow and darkness of the night. The dwarves haven't seen Lobram since. They claim that if you venture to the north, the mad, invincible dwarf, Lobram, will kill you. The dwarves of Bustwatched say that you can still hear his screams on the icy wind of the mountainside, a chilling reminder of what had come of their superstitions and negligence.